Okay, so we were talking about your flight on August 22nd of 1944.
Yeah.
How did that day start for you?
How did it start? Okay. Well, I had the day before I got a haircut and I had just returned from Corsica, and so I needed to sort of fix myself up a little bit, and got word that there was a mission on the following day, and that I was on the mission, and my position was going to be wingman for the group commander.
Okay.
Now, the wingman in a fighter squadron is first of all, the squadron is divided up into flights. My memory serves me right. A flight is the head, the leader of the flight, in this case the group commander, and he has two other aircraft flying a little bit behind and to one side. These are called wingmen.
Okay.
Their purpose is to protect his tail, make sure nobody sneaks up on him. Which means they've got one hell of a job, because not only have they got to keep their eyes open to where their leader is, so that if he makes some rapid, sharp turn or move, that they're aware of it and they stay with him. It's like trying to fly formation with somebody that's drunk
Yeah.
and they're all over the place. Well, but your task is to protect the leader's back end. P-38 has a blind spot, which is behind and below. A little bit below and behind. So if somebody comes in within that area, they can sneak up on you, and you won't know what hit you. So it's pretty important that you keep your eyes open, and it's very difficult to figure out
Mm-hmm.
what's happening. Once you enter a situation where you're in the middle of a dogfight, combat, it's hard to predict what's going to happen and whether you're doing the right thing.
Right.
You're in effect tasked to stay with the leader, and he's expecting you to stay on his wing and sort of protect him from a surprise attack from the rear. But that puts you in a vulnerable position too, because there's nobody protecting your tail.
Yeah.
So okay, so I felt kind of keen about the assignment. I said, okay, I don't know why they assigned me to the group commander. Maybe because I was a new man, and they wanted me to be with him, and he would perhaps evaluate my performance. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know what the hell
Right.
the situation is. So, On the day of the mission, which we get briefed on where we're going and all that, and we don't have too much time. The bomber group that we're going to escort is already in the air on its way to the target. Of course, they're slow, and but we're going to catch up with them. The things you have to do pretty rapidly. You expect your airplane is in good shape, so you can't spend too much time pissing around checking your airplane. You hope to hell that it's in good shape and everything's according to the book. You get in your airplane, your crew, the mechanic who is assigned to that airplane gets up on the wing and helps you get yourself settled in, make sure that you're strapped in properly. There's a seat belt that holds you in position, and you have a shoulder, two straps that come down over your shoulders. These hold you back, hold your whole body back, so that in the event of a crash, where you have rapid deceleration, these shoulder harnesses will keep you from traveling forward and getting yourself killed.
Right.
Because in front of you, right here, is a thing called a gun sight. This is what you view when you're looking at who the hell you're shooting at, and position yourself so that when you fire your weapons, you're doing a fairly decent job of aiming. Now, in aiming, in the case of a fighter, the critical thing there is lead. It's like shooting some of the things we used to do in training was firing at, I don't know what you call these things. They're discs that are thrown out.
Oh, like clay pigeons?
Yeah, clay pigeon.
Yeah.
Pull. You give the command pull, and zap, out comes a disc. You got a shotgun. What you do is you follow this disc, but you have to aim ahead of it.
Right.
Because otherwise you're missing it. So what it trains you to do is to lead your target, so that when you pull the trigger, your bullets will intersect with the course of the target. Now that's deflection shooting is very difficult. Mm-hmm. You have to be good, very skillful at judging how much lead to give a target, so that when you pull the trigger or press the button for the trigger, your bullets are going to intersect the course of the target.
Now, it says on here that your mask came off. Your mask came off?
Well, we'll get into that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Hey, Susan? Is Susan still here?
Yeah. Let me pause this.
I want to ask her something. We're talking about,
The mask coming off?
we'll get into that. We're getting to that. And I have this helmet and oxygen mask for two reasons. One is a souvenir of my last mission. And number two, I wanted it so I could try to figure out the dynamics of what happened on that day at a critical point in the dogfight. Okay, let's back up. We start up the engines. Everything's running fine. I'm strapped in. I'm waiting for the group commander's plane to come by. Pretty soon I see it coming. Taxis along right in front of me. He's heading for the end of the runway. Well, I know I'm supposed to fly his wing. So at the appropriate time I release my brakes and I swing in behind him. And I go to the end of the runway with him. And we both line up. He revs his engines up a little bit to test them, you know. And then he gives the throttle a nice shove forward, giving it full takeoff power, and begins to roll down the runway. I am now in position to fly formation with him. I am not looking down the end of the runway. I'm looking at his airplane.
Mm-hmm.
I'm maintaining my position by making sure that his airplane is in the same relative position to my canopy and so on. So that as long as his airplane is in that relative position, I know that I'm in a proper position with him. So we're flying down the runway on a takeoff roll. Soon his speed is sufficient to make him airborne, and because I'm right with him, mine is also, and we take off together. And we're both beginning to climb to altitude. After we get to altitude, we head out towards, across the Adriatic, towards Austria. But we're gonna first of all try to intercept the B-17 group that we're escorting. So someplace over, probably Yugoslavia, we run into our big friends, the B-17s, and the group commander decides to fly our P-38 formation through the B-17 formation real close, so all the members of the B-17 crew can see us up close, sort of morale things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's a beautiful sight, by the way. I still remember it. We were so close to these B-17s. They were nice, shiny, new B-17s. And I'm thinking to myself, just a few weeks ago, I would have been in one of those airplanes.
Right.
But I'm now out here. And what a wonderful thrill that is. And pretty soon we're away from the B-17s. I'm sure we're not far from them, but we're continuing to head towards the bombing target, which is up in Austria. Over Hungary, all of a sudden somebody yells, bandits, 1 o'clock low. And the next thing you know, we get the signal to drop tanks. Now, drop tanks means we all have to release our droppable fuel tanks. In addition to the fuel that's within the airplane itself,
Right.
which is our main supply, we have two huge tanks underneath the wing that are called drop tanks. And they hold a substantial amount of gasoline. when you first take off and fly towards your target, you are using the fuel from those tanks. You don't want to move to your main tanks unless you have to. And when that happens is when you encounter enemy activity, and you may be involved in maneuvering and fighting in a dogfight. But you don't want your gas tank, your extra gas tanks, hanging below your wings during that particular time in your flight. You want to be clean, and now you then switch from your drop tanks to your main tanks, and that happens boom boom real quickly. As soon as you are alerted to the fact that there's an enemy present in your vicinity, well, we got the word to drop tanks, and I remember looking down to my right, and there was a flight of Messerschmitts climbing up towards our position. Now, the Messerschmitt is a single-engine, German-made fighter that was a very good fighter. It was probably just as good as the P-51 Mustang that we had. The Mustang had certain attributes that made it perhaps a superior fighter. But essentially, as far as maneuverability and that kind of stuff, they were comparable. So we got the word to drop tanks. And then the next step is what's going to happen next. Because I'm still flying wing on my commander. Initially, he makes a very hard turn to the right, and then quickly changes direction and makes a hard turn to the left. And I think what he was doing was turning the airplane so that he could see what was in back. He was, in effect, wanting to make sure he wasn't being blindsided from the rear. Even though he knew that I was back there, he wanted to make sure. So he made this right turn and left turn, and I'm staying with him. And after making the left turn, I'm pulling on my control wheel. I don't know if you call it a wheel or yoke or whatever. But I'm pulling as hard as I can and making an extremely sharp turn. And in order to follow him, I am looking upwards through my canopy, the top part of my canopy, which moves my head, the axis of my head here, from this way to this way. And as I'm moving this way, I'm generating extremely severe centrifugal forces. These are known as G-forces. And what that stands for is, G stands for gravity. And they're usually measured in numbers of how many G's are you pulling. So if you're pulling 2 G's, then your centrifugal force is twice the pull of gravity. I don't know how many G's we were pulling, but it was a very severe turn. And I could feel my whole body getting very, very heavy. I never had that kind of training in the experience of experiencing high G-forces. Later on, I understand fighters were getting training in that, so they could experience it. And they also received special G-suits, which were flying suits that were inflatable. So as you generated G-forces, these G-suits, a pump would pump air into these suits and create a compression that kept your blood from leaving your brain and flowing towards your feet. That's what the G-suits were for. But we didn't have G-suits at the time. So the forces that we were generating during this turn were pretty substantial. And I don't know how many G's we were pulling, but they were substantial. And I remember looking up through the canopy, which tilted my head up this way. And the only thing I can explain is that somehow or other, the clasp of the oxygen mask, it came like this, see? Slipped out of its cradle, or slipped out of its mate. And the next thing I knew, the oxygen mask was loose, was flapping around in front of me with the strap, both of which were being forced outward by the G-forces and vibrating like this. I'm in the middle of a maneuver, in the middle of a combat maneuver, and all of a sudden, I've lost my oxygen. That's not a nice thing to have happen. So my initial thought was, I'm going to grab that damn strap and reattach the oxygen. I've got to have oxygen. I'm at 30,000 feet. At that altitude, if you're not breathing oxygen, you're going to be unconscious very quickly. So I realize I have only a limited amount of time. While I'm doing this, trying to catch this strap, which is vibrating in front of me, I am still looking out to see where the group commander is and flying the airplane, so I'm staying with him. So I'm doing two things at once, or trying to do two things at once. Not very easy to do that. And I'm unsuccessful. I can't seem to grab this damn strap. It's constantly vibrating so much that I can't get my hand on it. Number one, I'm only able to look at it kind of peripherally because my main concentration is on the group commander. I've got to stay with him. So I'm trying to stay with him, and at the same time, I'm trying to grab this damn strap and reattach it. And I'm not being successful. And very soon I begin to see the effects of being out of oxygen. I'm beginning to black out. And I'm in a high state of excitement. So I have other things acting on me. And I'm thinking to myself, real quick now, I better get that damn strap on, or I am going to be in deep doo-doo.
Yeah.
Because I'm running out of, I need oxygen. So I said, well, there's only one thing I can do. I've got to release the controls and grab that damn oxygen mask with both hands so I can reattach it and maintain my consciousness. So I had to release the controls, grab the mask, and proceed to put it on. Well, when I released the controls, the airplane, which was at that moment in a very steep bank, fell off on a wing, and I don't quite know what happened to it, but it obviously floundered. And to anyone looking at it from the outside would immediately assume, and correctly so, that I had a problem of some kind. The airplane was not acting according to what you'd expect it to do. And by the time I put this mask back on, I was partly handicapped. by lack of oxygen. I don't know whether I was unconscious, but I was getting that way. Because I had two things going. I had one, the lack of oxygen, and second, I had a high degree of excitement. And so I put this mask back on and began to take deep breaths to regain my awareness of where the hell I was and what was going on. And I don't know how many seconds all that took. When I finally regained full consciousness, I looked around. I could see no other airplanes. I was no longer flying on the wing of my group commander. I was alone. And I said, gee, I better get the hell with somebody else real quick. Now, the mistake that I made at that point was I didn't immediately go into another turn to see what the hell was happening around me. I just proceeded to fly towards another P-38 that was some distance, maybe a mile and a half away. I wanted to join that airplane. Well, I shouldn't have done that. I should have immediately made a turn to see what my situation was. But before I could say Jack Robinson, I felt my aircraft being hit by gunfire. The first thing that I felt was the rudder pedals gave a very rapid, violent kick, and then they became loose. In other words, my rudder cables, rudders were made useless. I no longer had rudders. And at the same time, the airplane was being hit by other bullets from an attacker who was in back of me. I didn't know, couldn't see him, but I could see some of the tracers passing over the top of my canopy. And I know that I was that close to being killed by machine gun and cannon fire. All of this was happening within a matter of 1 or 2 seconds. My immediate thought was, I have to get the hell out of this situation, because I'm a target of somebody sitting in back of me and trying to kill me. So I took the control wheel and I moved it very rapidly forward, causing the airplane to go into a very rapid nose-down position and dive towards the ground. Now, that's not normally the way you make a downward move in an airplane. Normally, you roll it over and you do this. Never that way, because when you do it this way, you are generating new forces, and you're creating what is called a red out situation. Now, red out is where instead of the blood leaving your head, causing you to lose consciousness, you now have blood flowing into your brain, because you're generating different forces in different directions. But in any case, I wanted to get the hell away from this character that was trying to kill me. So I dived straight down. And I'm picking up speed very rapidly, hoping that he is not following me. Now, I don't know what's happening in back of me. I have no way. All I know is I better do something to get myself out of this was a gunnery pattern. Somebody is using me for gunnery practice, so to speak. So I'm diving straight down, hoping this character is not following me. I don't know if he is or not. I'm diving straight down. Now the airplane has been damaged, but I still have some control. I have aileron control, for example, and I have control on my elevators. But I'm diving straight down. I'm rapidly picking up speed. I'm at 500 miles an hour very quickly. Now, the next thing that comes to my mind is this particular airplane, the P-38, is notoriously dangerous in that situation. It is known to kill a lot of people because at high speed, the controls freeze. And this phenomenon is unique to this airplane, and it has a name. It's called compressibility. I know this is the danger. And the further I'm going down, picking up speed all the time, the more dangerous this situation is becoming. So at about 10,000 feet, I say to myself, I better try to pull this thing out of this dive. I don't have too much time. I've only got about 10,000 feet left. And after that, I'm going to make a hole in the ground. So I start pulling back on the control wheel to pull the airplane up, and I can't do it. The controls are frozen. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's what they tell me it's going to happen. So I'm seeing it happen. So what? Now I'm really scared because I see the ground coming up very rapidly. And I can't seem to make the airplane start to pull out. It just keeps going straight down. So, at that moment, I feel that my days are over. I'm going to hit the ground, and I'm going to make one hell of a big hole. But I don't want to give up. I keep pulling and pulling. I'm going to be pulling until the last minute, the last second. Again, I don't know if this guy's following me or not, whoever it is. And would you believe that finally, at just sufficient time to save my ass, the airplane begins to respond and begins to pull out. And I continue to pull back. And the airplane continues to pull out. And it finally pulls out within a matter of 100 feet or so of the ground.
Oh.
And by now, I'm doing well over 500 miles an hour. Again, I don't know if the guy's in back of me or not. I'm beginning to think he's not, because if he were, he'd be putting some more bullets into me. And he probably thought that my rapid descent was that he killed me. So now I have another problem. What the hell to do? How badly am I damaged? I don't have much time for damage assessment. I've got to make a decision very, very rapidly. I've got to make a decision within a matter of seconds. If I don't make the right decision, I'm dead. Well, what are my options? I can try to fly back to Italy I can bail out, or I can crash land. The first option didn't sound very reasonable to me in view of the fact that my aircraft was damaged. I was deep in enemy territory. And I said, well, that doesn't sound like a good option. If I choose that option, I may never get back, period. So I consider the second two options. I'm doing all this in a matter of microseconds. Second option is to bail out. Well, I'm flying right on the deck. If I bail out here, the parachute won't have time to open before I hit the ground. So what do? Do I have enough speed to pull up and gain enough altitude to roll the plane over and fall out of the cockpit and open my parachute? Do I have time to do that? I can't answer that question. I don't know. I feel like I don't have the power to climb out other than through momentum. So I said, well, that's a pretty risky situation. If I pick that option, I may die, I'll be dead. At least that was my thinking at the time.
Right.
And the third option was to make a crash landing. The terrain around there was relatively flat, a lot of farms and fields like that. I said, well, I could probably save my life by pancaking, belly landing on a field. And, I'll save my life. Now, whether I made the right decision or not, you could argue that from now until the next man gets to the moon. I don't know. I may have made the wrong decision, but I know I made the right decision in terms of my life, because I'm still here. I saved my life.
So what did you do?
I crash landed.
Okay.
I picked a field far enough down, and I knew that whatever field I picked had to be the one that I make my attempt. There won't be a chance to go around and
Right.
try again or to find another field. You know what came back to me in my mind? The very same type of thing during primary flight training when the instructor used to cut the power and he'd say, okay, emergency landing. And then my task as a student was to find a reasonable place to land and to make an approach to this field as if I was going to land, as if it was a real emergency. I sort of, in the back of my mind, knew the instructor wasn't going to let me crash, but I had to make that decision, which
Right.
field to pick. And at the last minute, last second, before I hit the ground, the instructor would move the throttle forward, and off we'd go, and we'd, go around for another try or whatever. But that was his way of teaching me how to pick out a field
Right.
and make a judgment as to which field and how to approach the field, and to keep in mind that you won't get a second try. You can only do it one time. One chance. And so that's what I did. I picked a field out. I was still going too fast. I should have had much lower airspeed. by lower airspeed. I mean, you cannot land any way you want at going too fast, because your airplane is airborne and it's going to continue to fly as long as you have that excess speed. So the normal way of landing an airplane at an airport or anyplace else is you get the speed down to where it's close to stalling speed, and you pancake in and touch the runway right about the time that your speed drops down to where it no longer is flying speed.
Right.
And that keeps the plane on the ground instead of bouncing up in the air again. So here I am coming down. I picked this field out. I said, well, I don't know if I picked the right field, but it's the only field. I can't change my mind. I've got to use that field. Once you make your mind up,
Right.
that's it. So I'm approaching this field. Nobody's, as far as I know, is in back of me. I'm still, whoever shot me down thought I was dead and
Yeah.
went off. I'm still at excess speed just as I'm touching the ground. I said, well, one way to slow this damn airplane down is to crash it, belly landing it so that the friction of the ground against the body of the airplane will, in effect, slow it down or decelerate it substantially. And just as I'm touching the ground, I remembered I don't have my shoulder harness locked. And I immediately think about this gun sight in front of me. And when I hit this ground, I'm going to be decelerating so rapidly that it will be the equivalent of a head-on crash. In other words, I will be thrown forward very violently. But so I still have a little excess speed, so I immediately pulled back on the control wheel. The airplane hit the ground, bounced up into the air, and while it was in the air again, I reached down and I locked my shoulder harness. As soon as the shoulder harness was locked, I put my hands back on the control wheel and guided the thing down to the ground again. And as soon as it hit the ground, of course, it began decelerating very rapidly to the point where it knocked me out. My head was all over the cockpit. Because the plane kind of fishtailed. It didn't go in nice and smooth. It was a plowed field of some kind. So, I don't know how long I was before the plane came to a complete stop. Maybe half a minute or maybe 2 minutes, I don't know. It finally came to a complete stop. I'm a little unconscious because the deceleration and my head hitting the side of the cockpit, it kind of dazed me, knocked me out a little bit. So as soon as the plane came to a halt, I raised the canopy. Now my next job, I know it's got to be get the hell away from this airplane as fast as I can, because I don't know who saw me come in, what kind of alarm they sounded, that somebody's going to be coming after me, sure as hell. So I better get out of here and start moving. Now the thing that struck me as I took the canopy off above me was the utter silence. It was almost shocking. After all the noise of flying and all that happened up to that point, this silence was most unusual. But it was normal, but I didn't recognize it as normal. I just said to myself, my God, this is amazing. But there was one thing that broke the silence. That was the barking of a dog. Someplace I don't know how far away, but there was a dog barking. And, you know, dogs have better hearing
Right.
than the average person. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a dog someplace that was aware of the fact that something unusual had happened. That a man from Mars had just landed or something, you know, and he was barking. And so I said, get the hell out of here. Quickly I got out of my harness, my parachute, took my helmet off, my oxygen mask off, disconnected the radio, and I climbed out of this airplane, and I headed for a patch of woods that was off to the right. I ran upright until I got to this patch of woods. And as soon as I got into the patch of woods, I scooched down in the brush. I took off my yellow-colored life preserver, which we call the Mae West, so that in fact you landed in the water. This thing, you would release a couple of CO2 cylinders, and they would fill the Mae West with CO2, and it keep you afloat. I took this thing off and I buried it under some leaves so that it wouldn't be visible. I then ran a little bit further, and again I scooched down and I took out another thing that was with me, and it's called an escape kit. Everybody that flies in combat has to take with him a package about that big, about that thick, that contains certain things that are supposed to be helpful in your evasion, an attempt to escape capture.
Right.
So I tore that open, see what we had in there. Well, there was a rubberized pouch for water. There's a map of the area. There's a hacksaw. There's a compass. And there was how was that other thing?
Okay.
It was money. There's $58 in American money to be used for bribing purposes. Okay, I put all these things in my flying suit as best I could. Checked the compass. I said, okay, I know now which direction I gotta go. I'm gonna head for Yugoslavia. I know I'm in Hungary. I'm gonna try to go towards Yugoslavia, because I've heard that there were people there who might help me, called partisans, underground type forces. So I started heading towards Yugoslavia. Stashed the money in my pocket. The other things I put in one or two pockets. And now I'm going through the forest, the woods, as fast as I can. I'm standing up and running. It's a hot day. It's summertime. There are a lot of cobwebs in the forest. And as I run, I'm perspiring. These cobwebs are hitting me in the face. I'm not paying any attention to that. I just keep running. And every now and then I'd come to an open spot. No forest. Well, if I run across this open spot, somebody's going to spot me. So I got down on my belly, and I moved across this open area on my stomach till I got to a forest again. Then I'd stand up and I'd run some more. I was making my way southward. Now, today, looking at a map of where I went down, if I had continued in that direction for much longer, I would have ran into a thing called Lake Balaton, a very large lake in the middle of Hungary. I didn't know how far away I was from Balaton, but I kept going, and I'm in the woods, making my way south, when all of a sudden I hear a very strange noise. I can't identify it. I don't know what it is. But it's very strange. I said, I better stop and hide until I figure out what the hell this noise is and what it is. So I scooched down in the brush and waited because this noise was getting closer and closer, closer. Finally, the noise was almost on top of me. I said, man, whatever is making that noise should be visible by now. So I kind of parted the branches a little bit and I looked. And it was a horse-drawn carriage, 2 wheels, with an old man sitting, head down, slowly moving down this road, being pulled by a horse. Well, okay, that explains the noise. Now I better wait till he gets the hell down the road and disappears, because if I'm going to continue to go south, I've got to cross this highway. I call it a highway, it's really a country road, okay? Gravel, that's what was making the noise. Metal wheels on this horse-drawn wagon on the gravel. That was what the noise was. So I waited until the old guy with his horse-drawn wagon is out of hearing. I don't hear him anymore. I said, okay, time for me to cross this road. So I moved to the side of the road, which I didn't know was there, by the way, until this incident, spotting the wagon. And I looked both ways. I'm out in the boonies. There's forest all the way around. No buildings or anything. And I don't see anything either way. I think the coast is clear. I can now cross this road. I've got to cross it because I'm going south. So I stand up and I walk across this gravel road. As I do, I look on the other side and there's a steep embankment. And down at the bottom of the embankment is a railroad, single-track railroad. So, okay, no problem. I'm going to cross the railroad. There's another patch of woods, and I'm going to continue on my way to Yugoslavia. As I step down the embankment, I step practically on top of 2 guys eating their lunch. Looked like railroad workers, maybe. It was about noon, and they were having their lunch. I mean, I had no way of avoiding them. I mean, I practically stepped on them. They couldn't help but see me. And I had to make a decision real fast. How do I handle this situation? Okay, what are my options? I could ignore them and continue across the railroad track and continue my move southward and not worry about what they're going to do. That's one option. However, if I do it that way and they blow the alarm whistle, then people that are looking for me are going to know where the hell I am. And being afoot, I can't move very far, very rapidly, so they could quickly figure out the approximate area to search to find me. So I said, well, okay, I can't very well ignore them. If I ignore them, they're going to blow the whistle to where I am. I have a gun. It's loaded. I could kill these guys. But I didn't want to do that. I figured they were just poor working people. And so, and even if I did, that would alert the authorities all around that place that where I was. They'd hear the gunshots, and they'd find the dead bodies, and then I'd be searched with extra vigor. I didn't like that option. What's my other option? My other option was to sit down with them and try to communicate with them, to exchange thoughts and ideas. I wanted to see if they could help me. Help me do what? Well, I knew that in order for me to make a successful evasion, I could go around the countryside dressed with my flying suit. I had to get some clothing that would allow me to blend into the environment as a civilian. Okay? So how did I communicate with them? I spoke Polish to them. They couldn't understand it completely, and they spoke to me in a language that was not too different from Polish. Could have been Czech. I don't think it was Hungarian, because later on I heard Hungarian. It was really different. So we communicated in some way. And I let them know that I wanted to get some civilian clothes. Well, they agreed. Shook their head yes, but first they want to finish their lunch. So I sat down, while they finished their lunch, I sat down there and waited. Okay, I made my decision. It could have been the wrong decision. Reminds me today of Mahatma Gandhi's statement, "The future depends on what we do in the present." And boy, how many times have I run into that truism?
Yeah. So what did you end up doing?
Huh?
What did you end up doing?
Yeah. So they get through their eating, and we proceed to climb up this embankment back on the road. And I'm assuming that they're going to take me to where they live and get me some civilian clothing. That was an understanding I thought we had. I realized that that was partially wishful thinking, but I didn't really have another alternative. The other alternatives that I considered were still there, but as time went by, they became less viable and less viable. So I stayed with them. We continued to walk down this road. And pretty soon we came to an intersection. And there's no buildings, just forest all the way around. So I couldn't see what was down this side road. I couldn't see. We couldn't see what was down there until after we made the turn. So when we made the turn, we ran into two bicycles being ridden by uniformed, I concluded, Hungarian military police. They quickly jumped off their bicycles and leveled their rifles at me. Well, I didn't have to think three times what to do there. I wasn't going to try to pull my gun out and engage in a Wild West shootout. I raised my hands. I gave up. In other words, they had, in my mind, they had the drap on me.
Right.
And while they were holding their rifles on me, I reached in, took my 38 caliber. I was wearing a civilian type gun, which is different from those guns that most airmen carried. Most airmen flew with American Army 45 caliber from Colt, automatic. What I was wearing was a revolver, 38 caliber Smith & Wesson. Pulled it out and handed it to them. Meanwhile, my two erstwhile friends were talking a mile a minute to these guards in a language that I hadn't heard before, and I assumed it was Hungarian. And I surmised that what they were doing is making sure that they didn't give these guards the impression that they were helping me, but rather that they were bringing me in, because they seemed to be rather concerned about what it looked like. But that was the least of my worries. Right now, I'm a prisoner. And these two guards now escort me down the road till we finally came to a small little village or something. And I ended up being placed in a jail cell in this little, what the hell you call it, a village, or maybe not even a village, it's the outskirts of a village. But there was this jail there, and the guard who ran this jail opened it and put me in, and I'm in this one cell jail. I am locked up. And there begins a whole new adventure.
Okay. You know what? I'm going to pause it right here.
Okay.
We are here for day 2 with Mitchell Cwiek. Go ahead, Mitch, and finish what you're saying.
Right. I just want to mention something that was left out during the session last time. During my high school days, shortly after the war began, I joined the Aircraft Observer Corps, which was a civilian organization organized to provide information on aircraft movements to the Air Defense Command at the filter center at Mitchell Field, Long Island. There were a number of observation posts scattered over New England with volunteers serving 2 hours at a time looking for aircraft movements. We had no radar at the time. And so this was our attempt to maintain some type of control or information about what was happening in the air above our country. And what it involved was spending 2 hours as needed to keep your eye peeled for any aircraft movement. And usually you operated on a high point someplace in town, and there was a little shack with a telephone, and the telephone was directly connected to Mitchell Field in Long Island, where they had the filter center maintaining control. Each observer had a pad. There was a form that permitted you to report certain characteristics of the aircraft movement. And when you picked the phone up and you said flash, they knew exactly who was calling, where you were located, and then you read off the information you had on the card. For example, you would tell how many aircraft there were they flying low, medium, or high, how many engines the aircraft had, and I think one or two other items. But that was a sequence in which you reported each time so that you were on the phone a very short period of time giving essential information. And as the aircraft moved from one point to another, various observation posts would pick those up and report them to the Air Defense Center at Mitchell Field. That was our attempt to maintain some form of control or information about air movement. The British had the same thing, by the way, and it was a stopgap prior to the installation of good radar sites. And so I did that throughout my senior year in high school, and I used to get great pleasure in excusing myself from certain classes because I was scheduled to be on alert at the aircraft observer post. And so that was my contribution to the war effort during that period. As soon as I graduated, of course, I joined the Air Force. I wanted to bring that into the picture because I think that was perhaps important.
Okay.
So we'll take off from there to where we left off during the previous session, which was the incidents that followed my capture by these two armed guards near the small town of Cwiek, Hungary, which was located just off the southwestern corner of a very large lake called Lake Balaton in Hungary. The two gentlemen who were ostensibly helping me were pretty scared because they were worried that they might be suspected of giving me aid and assistance. So as soon as we were accosted by the armed guards, they did some very rapid talking in Hungarian. I didn't know what they were saying, but I think they were possibly interjecting information that would absolve them of any suspicion of giving me aid and comfort. The two guards escorted me to a small village right next door, which is the town of Cwiek, S-U-M-A-G. And I want to point out that in that part of Hungary, the war effort probably was just a distant bit of news, and the people there were not in any way traumatized or aggravated by news or events associated with the war. So they put me in this little one-room cell in this little town, brand new whitewashed walls, and I had no idea that I was going to stay there 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month, 1 year. It was just a big mystery, and I was extremely uptight, for obvious reasons. I settled down in this jail cell, and I said, well, I better see what I can do to improve my situation. And I took out the package of money that was part of my escape kit, and I dropped it between my basic trousers and my flying suit. Now, my flying suit was buttoned at the bottom near my ankles, so the package of money did not fall all the way through, although I was concerned that it might fall out if I walked too vigorously. So I'm sitting in a cell wondering what's going to happen next. I look through the window, and there's a little boy out there, about 7 years old, playing. And I communicated with him, and I don't remember exactly whether it was part English, part Polish, sign language or what, that I wanted a pencil and a piece of paper. And he delivered. He brought that in and slipped it under the door to the cell, and I proceeded to write a "to who it may concern" type memorandum saying, I insist on being treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. I didn't want to be left there to rot in that little one cell jailhouse.
And so how long did they hold you there?
Well, I was only there a very short period of time. Within 24 hours, as a matter of fact, I was marched out of there up the town street, cobblestone pavement, and all the homes were right up on the sidewalk. And to make sure this escape money, did not fall through my flying suit, I made believe that I had a damaged leg, and I walked very slowly, keeping my right knee stiff and not bending it, and moving very slowly. Of course, this provided more time for the housewives in that area to observe the show. And every house that was right on the sidewalk, there would be a woman standing in front of the door, usually with a baby in her hands. They were all out there watching the show. The show was this character that was captured and was being marched through the city streets. It was kind of, and under normal circumstances, I would be extremely embarrassed, but under these conditions, I was doing the best I could to keep this escape money from falling out. They marched me down to the end of the street into a headquarters in which there were additional soldiers, and a doctor arrived to check me out to see if I had any serious wounds and so on. And they did a cursory search of my clothing, but they didn't go far enough down to feel this money that was still located between my pant leg and my flying suit. And following this little episode, I was marched back through the city street to the jail cell. The next day or so, I was marched out of there to a railroad station, passenger station, where civilians were buying tickets and so on. And these two guards escorted me onto one of the trains, and we were sitting in a compartment, 2 seats in each compartment, the seats facing each other. The two guards sat on one side with their rifles. I sat on the other side. And it was a regular civilian coach moving in a normal fashion. As I sat there, of course, I was a subject of some attention because obviously I was under guard, and the passengers were kind of wondering about me. Some uniformed Hungarian soldiers came by. One of them, who had a string of medals on his tunic, looked me over and proceeded to try to bargain with me. He wanted me to give him my silver wings, and he offered to give me one of his medals. And I said, no, no, no. And he went on, because the guards didn't want him to fool around with me. We got to the destination, which was a larger town. I can't remember the name. I looked at it on a map once, and it was a real long name. About midway between Cwiek and Budapest, on the western side of Lake Balaton. There we we got off the train and we're waiting for another train to come by and pick us up. And that gave me an opportunity to look around and see what was happening. There were people on the platform waiting to travel one way or the other. They didn't pay too much attention to me. Well, one of the people that was on the platform was a uniformed gentleman who obviously was a flyer. He had wings on his tunic, and I decided to try to converse with him, and it just so happened he could speak a little English. As one flyer to another, a subject of conversation was flying, and I asked him, are you getting enough flying time? And he said, no, but they promised to get me some gas very soon. I didn't say anything, but I was tickled to death to hear him say that, because what it showed was that our attacks on oil targets was effective, and it was hurting their war effort. A little later down the line, again, the guards are with me, a group of civilian women, and a very large, burly-looking gentleman who apparently was a railroad engineer, were wondering who I was, and they were questioning the guards to find out what the story was. And the guards explained to them, obviously, that I was being taken to Budapest as a prisoner of war. Of course, they were very interested. The big gentleman, who was an engineer, looked at my flying suit, and he noticed that I had some P-38s drawn on the left side of my flying suit, and he then became very angry and went towards me as if in an aggressive manner. The guards raised their rifles and kept him away from me, but he was getting ready to attack me, apparently, because the appearance of the P-38s must have reminded him of some incidents in his life that were not too pleasant. One of the things that our aircraft sometimes did on returning from a mission was attack locomotives and railroad traffic. So he may have been attacked at one time or other, and he had some bad feelings about that. Okay, one more trip, and we were at our destination, was a small but larger town than the one at Cwiek. Cwiek was a small village, but this is a much larger city. And here we are, again, are marching down the street. I'm about 10 to 20 paces ahead of the guards. They're in back of me with their rifles. We're walking down the sidewalk, no traffic at all. On the other side of this street, no passengers or of any kind, but an old lady is walking down the street in opposite direction, and as we were walking along, I could see out of the corner of her eye that she was getting ready to cross the street, and she was doing so in such a way that she was going to be crossing the street diagonally and intercepting me. She was obviously intent on accosting me in some way. I didn't pay any attention to her, but I could see her out of the corner of my eye. As we marched along, she crossed the street, mounted the sidewalk that I was on, came up to me, and she spit into my face. And I didn't even wipe it off. I just kept going. And she proceeded someplace. The guards didn't do anything about it because what she did was very sudden and sort of unexpected.
Yeah.
So they made no effort. We then arrived at regional headquarters of some kind. I was marched into this large room. There was an officer sitting on the other side of the room on a telephone. And so I stood on the opposite side of the room at parade rest with my hands and back. Parade rest is where you stand still and look straight ahead, you don't make any movements. In other words, I was standing waiting for his pleasure, whatever he wanted to do. And while I'm doing that, there's a little mousy character, probably a police trustee of some kind, but he didn't look like a very savory person. But he was kind of moving around me and eyeing me, and I was ignoring him completely. But then he started pecking away at different things on my uniform, my flying suit, and apparently seeing if he could take something as a souvenir or something. The man on the telephone continued to talk and he ignored us. But then after a little bit of this monkey business, I decided it was enough. And I yelled very loudly and looked at this character and told him to lay off of me. And my sudden aggressive response kind of scared this guy, and he kind of bounced away. And of course that also alerted to the officer on the telephone that something was going on. And he looked up and he ranted and raved in Hungarian at this guy, and this guy took off. When the man got through with his telephone conversation, he motioned the guards to take me through a door, and they put me into a cell. And in this cell, there were about 8 other prisoners. They were all Americans. And so I was, in a way, kind of happy to see Americans.
What was the highest rank?
What?
What was the highest rank of those 8?
They were all lieutenants, second lieutenants, which was the majority of our flyers at the time were of that rank. Now and then you'd run into a higher ranking officer. But I want to mention a few things about this cell. One of the gentlemen in the cell was wounded. He was moaning. I asked the other people in the cell, I said, what do you do if you have to go to the toilet? And they said, well, there's no toilet in here, but what you do is you bang on the door, and a guard will come and he'll escort you to the latrine. I said, okay. Then I looked around and I noticed there were a number of propaganda posters on the wall, and they stay in my mind. These are little incidents that I remember, so I'm trying to go chronologically here.
Okay.
Anyhow, one of the posters was a painting of a child with bleeding hands, a doll laying at her feet, an American bomber flying up above, and the obvious implication of the picture was that American airmen were dropping booby-trap bombs, and young children were picking them up, and these were then exploding and wounding the children. That was the intent of that particular poster. Another poster showed airmen, one of whom looked obviously like an ape. What they were trying to do is depict the American airmen as Negroes. And that was a propaganda route that they followed in some respects. And I looked at these things and I said, well, that's something I'll remember, but it didn't mean anything to me except that it revealed the propaganda tactic of the enemy. After a couple of days in this cell with the other Americans, we were all taken out to the railroad yard, and this time we were put into a boxcar with 2 guards. The guards had rifles. The train took off. I didn't know where we were going. it so turned out that we were going to Budapest. I didn't know that at the time. So as we proceed to move along in this boxcar, the two guards sat down in the open door of the boxcar with their legs hanging down, and they were obviously enjoying the scenery. They weren't paying any attention to the prisoners inside the boxcar. Their backpacks were hanging on a nail inside the boxcar. Right in back of the two guards was a bundle of contraband that they had captured from down there. So I sauntered over to this pile of contraband and I sat on it. I wanted to make sure that I didn't arouse any suspicion, so I was very nonchalant. But while I was sitting there, I proceeded to use one of my hands to rummage through this contraband to see if I could find anything worth confiscating. I found a jackknife, which I took, and I then proceeded to move to the other side of the boxcar, and I told the other people there, prisoners, American prisoners, to sit close to me so that if these guards turned around and looked, they wouldn't see me. I then proceeded to use the jackknife to open the seams in the bottom of my trousers, and I took the escape money, which I still had, by the way, and I folded it so that each bill was folded as tight as possible, and I then inserted it into the opening at the bottom of my trousers and moved it around so that eventually I got all $58 of American money inside the bottom of my trousers. And I said, they're going to really have to do a pretty thorough search to find these now. The next thing I did is I took my knife, my jackknife, and I started looking and feeling inside one of these backpacks that the two guards had hung up on a nail. I felt inside the backpack, and I noticed there was a big sausage in this one. One of these loop sausages. I then used a knife to cut off a big hunk of sausage, brought it out. I had a little myself, and then I passed the rest out to the other guys in the car. And of course the guards are still oblivious to what's going on behind them. They're looking out the scenery. And I remember one of the American prisoners said to the other one, and another one, he said, if anybody is going to get us out of this mess we're in, it's going to be this guy. Meaning me. Of course, they were very glad to get that piece of sausage because we were all hungry as hell. We got to our destination, and sure enough, it was Budapest. They piled us into a pickup truck, a couple of pickup trucks, and they proceeded to drive across a very beautiful bridge. I think it must have been the Danube River. Across this bridge, and people walking around. There was nothing special going on. But one thing that struck me, and I remember looking at, one of the civilians that was on the street there was wearing an overcoat, and on the overcoat was a big yellow Star of David. I said, I know what that is. They're persecuting these Jews because they're now, they're under Hitler's control. And of course, anti-Semitism, I learned, was pretty prevalent in Europe even before Hitler started his rampage. But with Hitler in control of everything, it intensified. And Jews had to walk around with some kind of indication that they were Jews. The pickups eventually dropped us off at a very strange-looking place. Huge concrete walls, approximately 30 feet high. Inside these walls was a huge structure which turned out to be a penitentiary. I later found some satellite photography of this building, and I could see exactly how it was made and what it looked like, and it certainly fit my memory of what it was like too. It was had 3 wings. It was multi-storied, probably 3 or 4 stories, and each wing was equal in length and separated by about 120 degrees, so that people looking out of the windows from one of the wings could see the side of another wing. They walked us into this enclosed yard, and there we were waiting to do whatever they wanted to do with us. Meanwhile, there were some Hungarian guards nearby watching as we came in, and some of the Hungarian guards were making obscene gestures, which were pretty obvious that they were accusing us through their gestures of being Jews and that we were under arrest. And we ignored them. We just kept looking straight ahead and got into another area of the penitentiary where we were going through a cursory search again. While we're waiting to be taken into this and searched individually, another mousy character, who was obviously a trustee of some kind, approached us and in pidgin English said that once we get in there, they're going to get anything of value that we have. So if we want to keep what we have of value, we should give it to him, and then he would return it to us when we got through with the search. And I said to myself, well, anybody that believes that crap, is out of his cotton-picking mind. So nobody in the group I was with gave this character anything. I was wondering if they were going to take my wristwatch, because I was not wearing a GI wristwatch, which is a black government issue watch. I was wearing a watch that I bought myself. It was gold. It was a Longines, a very expensive watch. And for some reason or other, they didn't bother it, didn't take it. But they didn't find my knife. They didn't search me thoroughly enough. But later downstairs in another part of the penitentiary, we were now going to go through a thorough search. On each side of us are various stories. There's, how to explain this. If you've ever seen pictures of Sing Sing, this is what it looked like. You had a bunch of cells at each level, and we were down at the bottom level. We were sitting down on the concrete in line, and they're taking us one at a time for a thorough search. I still got my jackknife. Of course, I'm not worried about my money because that's inside the bottom of my trousers. So after about 4 or 5 people were searched, I got up and went to the back to the latrine. There was a latrine in the back of that area. And I went to the latrine. I noticed that there was a high window. I reached up and I put my jackknife up on the windowsill. I could barely reach it. And I left it there. Then I came back, and instead of sitting down where I was before, I went to the front of the line and spoke to one of the prisoners that had already been searched. And I said to him, I have a jackknife on the windowsill in the latrine. Please get it and hold it until after I'm searched, then you can return it to me. He says, okay. So sure enough, he went back there, obviously picked up the knife, because he later gave it to me. And so I was able to get through this search without the jackknife being found. And I've kept that knife throughout my days as a prisoner. I brought it home with me. And I used it for many, many things. And I will tell you more about that later. After this search, we were all put into solitary confinement. Now that, again, I want to point out that not knowing how long you're going to be incarcerated is bad enough. Being put in solitary confinement is even worse. You don't know how long you're going to be kept in there. And the uncertainty is pretty debilitating. As opposed to the escape training people are being given now, they're dropped off in very desolate places, in the jungles and stuff, to give people an opportunity to experience survival tactics. Well, under civilian conditions, survival tactics training is good, but it has one feature that makes it less than 100% effective, and that is the knowledge that it's a training exercise, and when the training exercise is finished, you're going to be sitting in the officers' club having a beer, and that won't be long. But when you're a prisoner, you don't know. Everything is a mystery, and the mystery and the fact that you don't know what's going to happen next is kind of adds to the misery. And that's the intent. The whole purpose of us being there was to prepare us for interrogation. And so far we have not run into any Germans. So far, my only contact has been with Hungarian troops. Now, while in prison, in the cell, in this solitary confinement cell, we would be given little bowls of soup once a day. The bowl was about 7 inches in diameter, made of aluminum, and it was very watery lentil soup. But the interesting thing about these bowls was that there were messages on the bowls. The various prisoners who received these bowls of soup had some kind of device that they used to scratch messages in the side of the bowl. And what they would put in there was news about the war. For example, I remember reading on one of them that Paris had been recaptured. And there were other bits and pieces of that kind. And the fact that we were able to, in some small way, communicate in that way was a morale booster. Now, the thing that was not a morale booster was the conditions in those cells. It was dark, and it was, I would say, occupied by some extremely hungry Hungarian fleas. And I was always very careful about maintaining cleanliness and being free of any type of vermin. And the idea of being bitten by these fleas was extremely distressing to me. And in the dark, I couldn't see these damn fleas, but I could feel them biting me. And even after they bit me, the bite itched terribly, and the little twinges of pain almost seemed like additional bites. And I was getting kind of desperate because I didn't know how long I was going to have to stay in there. One of the things I did was I took the water from a drinking pail, and I spread water in a circle around me, and sort of a hope that water would keep these damn fleas away from me. Didn't do any good. I was getting extremely distressed to the point of I felt I was kind of losing my ability to cope with this situation. And it's pitch dark. Finally, in desperation, I got up and I went up against one of the walls in the cell, and I closed my eyes and I said, Jesus, help me. And then I experienced something that it's hard to tell people because most of them don't believe it. But the cell suddenly was filled with the brightest light. It just was so bright that it almost blocked out everything. And the source of the light was on the opposite side of the cell, was an image of a person, and it looked like something that I remembered from my youth when I was attending classes in church. There was a statue in front of the church near the altar, a statue of Jesus. And I remember looking at that statue while I was a young person attending this class. And it's that image, that appearance, that I saw in the middle of this light. And the light lasted for about, 10 or 15 seconds. I was stunned by it. I didn't know what to say or do. But then the light disappeared, and when it disappeared, I felt so relieved, so calm. The fleas didn't bother me anymore.
It's amazing.
I don't care what you say, but whatever I saw had a positive effect. And from then on, I didn't worry about fleas, even though they were biting me. And 1 or 2 days later, I noticed there was a pipe going through the cell. It was near the floor, where the wall and the floor come together. There was a pipe. It was coming through the wall, through my cell, and into the next wall. So I said, I'm going to try something. I took my jackknife and I start sending Morse code messages. Scrape for a dash, a tap for a dot, dot, scrape, dot, scrape. I still remembered Morse code from my aviation cadet days. I still remembered the code for each letter. And I proceeded to send a message on this pipe. And lo and behold, I got a response, also in Morse code. And I don't know how far down that pipe went, how far the respondent was, but we were communicating with each other. And that ability to communicate was extremely important for morale. He was telling me in his message that about a sergeant in a nearby cell who had lost his cool, lost his whatever, went bananas, and they took him away. but he apparently the stress of it all got to him. Well, here we sat, and here I am in this cell waiting what's going to happen next. Eventually, I got taken out and taken to a place down on the first floor for interrogation. And I finally meet my first German officer. Excuse me. So I'm kind of interested in how this is going to go. There's a desk, a chair. I'm told to sit down. On the table, on the desk, is a package of Lucky Strike cigarettes. The German officer says, "Would you like to have a cigarette?" Of course, I was a smoker at the time and suffering nicotine withdrawal because I couldn't get any smokes, during all this time. So I was glad to take one of those cigarettes, lit it, and then the interrogation proceeded. He started out by wanting to know what unit. Well, first of all, I gave him the usual name, rank, and serial number. But he said, "Well, I also want to know what unit you were with." And I said, "I can't tell you that." He said, "But it's in the Geneva Convention, so you're supposed to tell me that." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "Yes, it is." And he handed me a pamphlet. He says, "Read this page right here." So I'm reading the page. It says, the prisoner's supposed to give his name, rank, and unit number. And I clapped my hand on a little pamphlet, and I read back, and I says, "Anybody can print something like this. How am I supposed to know that that's authentic?" He blew his stack. He banged the tables. "You insulted a German officer." Bang, he ran and raved. And I said, "Okay, this is another one of his techniques, see?" So I let him rant and rave for a while. And he said, "Well, you look out the window there." He says, "You see those prisoners walking around? They're going to be leaving tomorrow on a train to a big prison camp where they're going to be able to play basketball, they're going to be able to play soccer and read books and have a nice life. You want to be with them?" "Yes." "Well, then you have to answer my questions." "Nope." He said, "All right, back solitary." So off I go with this guard to go back to solitary. And I'm feeling about as low as a snake. And as we walk up the stairs, the guard says to me, "Tomorrow, transport." And I said to myself, well, okay, that sounds pretty good to me because it sounds like he knows something that I don't know. Now the guard didn't take me back to solitary confinement. He put me in another cell, a big cell with about 12 or 13 prisoners in it. Apparently they were collecting the people who had already been interrogated for transportation someplace. So here I am with these other prisoners in this big cell. And we're there a couple of days at least, and bored to death, wondering what's going to happen next. But one of the things we do to amuse ourselves is stand up on one of the beds. A bed was nothing but a steel with springs and nothing comfortable. We would stand up on this bed and look out the window. There was a window up kind of high, and when you looked out this window, you could see another one of the wings of this penitentiary. Well, to amuse ourselves, we were harassing a guard. There was a guard that used to walk up and down out on the courtyard, an elderly soldier, and we would harass him with remarks like, well, you're not down the Eastern Front, but you will be pretty soon, blah, blah, blah. And of course, the voice was loud enough so that the prisoners in the other wing of the penitentiary could hear, and they would roar with laughter, and we would roar with laughter. Pretty soon it was a kind of a comical thing, you know. We would say things that would cause laughter, but this guard, poor bastard, he didn't know what we were saying, but he could tell from the laughter that he was being insulted. So pretty soon he disappeared. And one of the guys that did most of the harassing was a first lieutenant. He was the ranking officer. And we called him Pappy. He had a very black beard. And he did some of the key harassment. And about a couple hours later, the door to the cell opens, and in comes quite obviously, the chief jailer. Big belly and looking very serious, and he's looking around, looking around. He's looking for somebody, and finally he spots Pappy. We called this First Lieutenant Pappy because he was older than the rest of us, and he was ranked us. We were all second lieutenants. So the chief jailer, this fat guy, had with him the guard from down below who was marching up and down, who was being harassed. Obviously, here's what happened. The guard complained to his boss that he was being harassed and demanded that, that the chief jailer do something about it. Well, okay, so the chief jailer was in there to do something. So we're all sitting around wondering what's going to happen. So the fat man looks around, he finally spots Pappy. And of course, because of the black beard, it kind of marked him as the guy doing some of the harassment. So he walked over to, slowly to this, to Pappy, and suddenly whacked him in the face. And Pappy turned red and went for this guy and said, "You just struck an American officer." And this chief honcho pulled out his pistol, aimed it at the guy, and started backing out of the cell. And the guard, who had been down below with his rifle, he was backing out too, because there was about 14 of us, and they were concerned that, you know, if thing came to a altercation, that they could be overwhelmed. And so they backed out of the room, and he backed out with his pistol drawn, closed the door, and that's the last we heard of that. Now, why is that kind of important? Well, it's part of the story, because a couple days later, when the time came for us to be put on a boxcar and shipped to someplace, we all looked around, and we were all apparently there, except there was one person was missing, Pappy. Pappy was missing. And we were kind of worried about that. We didn't know where we were going, but the point is, we were concerned about Pappy. So we're sitting in this boxcar waiting to depart, and soon a black sedan comes up and stops near our boxcar. The door opens. Two civilians get out of the car. They open the back door, and out comes Pappy. They tell him to get in the boxcar, and then they drive off. So we look at Pappy and say, "What the hell is going on? Like, what happened?" We figured he was being, you know, given a 1, 2, 3. He said, "Well, they took me to a real nice restaurant." I said, "What?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "Well, did they tell you why?" "No, they just said, they just took me." Well, later on, we heard, and I don't know how true this is, that the Germans had a practice of taking the highest ranking officer of each group of prisoners and take them to a nice restaurant as a gesture of some kind, to show how wonderful they were, you know. That's one story. That's one idea. Now the other idea was, and again, this is probably far-fetched, but who knows? There's also a feeling that the Germans wouldn't allow a bunch of prisoners to be in any of these cells, particularly where there was a large number of prisoners together, without the plain thing being bugged. And that they must have been 100% aware of what had been going on. And they were aware of the altercation between Pappy and the guards. Well, you might say, well, why would they be concerned about that? It's not the fact they were concerned so much. Our feeling was that they somehow or other could identify with the reaction of Pappy. That's exactly the way a German officer would react. The way that German officer reacted when I told him that the pamphlet he gave me to read could have been forged. Germans have put a high regard towards rank.